Thank you, Lynn. Firstly, I thought I'd just share a little bit about myself and why I'm personally interested in this area of reconciliation and where I fit into the whole picture and how that might help us in general explore what reconciliation means and who has responsibility for reconciliation within our nation. My background is my mother was an Aboriginal woman, and she was born in Northern Territory, and she was part of the stolen generation. So I'm a product of the stolen generation. Over the last 20 years or so, I've been exploring what that means for me as a person and what it means for perhaps other products of the stolen generation and what it means for my own children, and exploring, I guess, a little bit out loud as well, what it means for the church in general. Alongside my responsibility at St Jude's, I'm also a member of a group which is called the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Anglican Council, and that's a council of General Synod which was formed in 1993, and it's basically the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice of the Anglican Church of Australia. And I've been part of that group for close to 20 years now, and for the last couple of years I've been deputy chair of that particular group. From that group I was elected one of 5 members of the Australian contingent of the Anglican Indigenous Network, which is a subcommittee of the Anglican Consultative Council. And every 2 years we meet together with Indigenous people from Hawaii, New Zealand, Canada, the United States of America and Australia. And we meet every 2 years to basically discuss common concerns for Indigenous people around the globe. Membership of that group is primarily for Indigenous people who are minorities within their own land. So I regard it as being a great blessing and an honour to be a part of those groups, NATSIAC and AIM. And I see myself very much as being on the receiving end on that group, because there are many people in NATSIAC who come from more remote communities in the Northern Territory and North Queensland, and there are others who come from other parts of Australia. So I really see it as a wonderful blessing to sit at their feet, and I feel honoured that I can serve them as the Deputy Chair. And I think whatever I say, I hope supports the overall ministry of NATSIAC and broader the Anglican Indigenous Network. Married to Susan, and we have 3 children. Alongside those 2 responsibilities, apart from children being married to Susan and being a rector, studying for a PhD through Flinders University, looking at how the Trinity shapes the way we go about doing Anglican ministry. So I see very much that reconciliation, of course, is echoes, if you like, the Trinitarian relationships of equality in the Trinity, Father, Son and Holy Spirit. There is a relationship of equality and mutuality and giving and making space for each other within the Trinity. So I'm hoping to do some thinking a bit more about how that impacts upon the way that we minister as Anglicans, not just clergy but also laity as well. So I guess that's just a little bit about me and a little bit from where I'm coming from. The question that I was given was, whose reconciliation? And so tonight I'm really trying to provoke us to think about taking up some responsibility, each one of us, for this ministry of reconciliation, in particular between Indigenous and non-Indigenous members of Australia. So, thank you, Lynn, for the opportunity for giving me to share some few thoughts on reconciliation. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the first custodians of the land that we're meeting on, the Gama people. I think it's important that we do that. when we gather, we recognise that non-Indigenous Australians weren't here first. So Indigenous people were here first. So we need to recognise that they had prior ownership of the land. I want to begin with a passage, and if you like, it reflects quite well with Lynn's text that he was using from 2 Corinthians. The one I'm using is from the well-known Sermon on the Mount from Matthew's Gospel, and Matthew chapter 5 verses 23 to 26. Jesus says, "So if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go first be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Make friends quickly with your accuser while you're going with them to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out till you have paid the last penny." Here I think Jesus is encouraging his listeners to consider those to whom they may have committed some wrong, and to do their best to make amends for it. In fact, Jesus suggests that their worship will be somehow impinged by the fact that there is something against them, that their own worship will be impeded by this error on their behalf. And the full impact of their worship, for it to be acceptable, the wrong must be put right. And of course that's the theme that is taken up in our Anglican form of confession, isn't it? Before we really offer our act of worship, we make our confession. So through our confession we're putting things right, at least within our own minds. And of course hopefully we do some sort of acts to form reconciliation with others if we remember that there is something that they have against us. But what interests me here is that Jesus provokes his hearers to act on their memories. To act on their memories. Not to ignore them. So if they remember something, then Jesus is encouraging them to go and do something about it. Not to ignore the memories. And he's suggesting with some spontaneity, and I guess there would have been some degree of potential controversy, leaving the act of worship and then acting on reconciliation. So Jesus is really painting a picture that there's some haste involved in this. Go and do it now. Don't leave it. Don't forget about it. Go and do it. Before you offer your worship, respond to your memory. Remember and do something about it. He goes on to say that true liberation, being freed from the prison, is not ours until the last penny has been paid. True liberation, being freed from the prison, is not ours until the required act of reconciliation has been made. That's the thought I want to come back to a little bit later. I just mentioned that Jesus is encouraging his hearers then and hearers now to act on their memories. When they remember something, do something about it. In a fairly recent book coming out of England called Praying for England, which is really a collection of essays by a group that's called the Littlemore Group. And the Littlemore Group are youngish clergy who are doing some thinking and praying about how might the Church of England respond to the changing place that the Church of England has in England. The Church of England, even though it's an established church, is being marginalised, really, in the nation. And of course we know that from our own experiences of just being Anglicans here in Australia. So these youngish clergy, and I've looked at some of their ages and they're not that young. Some of them are older than me, so they must be well in their 50s and perhaps 60s, but they're presenting themselves at least as youngish, or at least young-minded clergy. One of those who writes an essay in that book is a priest and a theologian who's called Andrew Shanks. And he writes a provocative piece on honesty. He argues that the theological motivation for honesty lies in the recognition of the resurrection of the crucified one, Jesus, as being God's verdict on refusing to collude with bullying power. To say that again, the recognition that the resurrection of the crucified, Jesus, is God's verdict of refusing to collude with bullying power. For the Church of England, he argues, and we can add Anglican Church of Australia, to minister to its context with any sense of integrity, it has to face up to its past and also its present with honesty. There is a tendency, Shanks writes, for the Christian faith to lapse into evasiveness rather than confrontation, and to avoid confrontation with what he described bullying power, but also to avoid its own history of collusion. He's arguing that there's a tendency within the Church of England to whitewash its own history. Adding to this in the same collection of essays, Rowan Williams argues that the church is essentially characterised by a vulnerability and honesty that prompts careful self-scrutiny as to whether we have begun to take for granted the maps offered by the contemporary world, which he would say is a map in which there is finding no place free from rivalry or potential violence. He's saying that the church needs to look at itself as a place of vulnerability and a place of honesty. Very much, I think, what this is about here. Providing a safe space for thinking out aloud so that we can think about issues such as reconciliation in a sense of vulnerability and with honesty. This safe space, the possibility of what the church can offer, is a place that we dare to call to mind remembered sins. Jesus, of course, said, if anyone has anything against you. The Shanks and Williams, both from their different perspectives, are arguing that the church is the place where we own the honesty and the truthfulness and safe space for sharing it. The history of the church's involvement with the indigenous people of the world, but in particular with Australia, is a complex one. It wouldn't be quite right to call it all bad, but it wouldn't be quite right to call it all good either. There's much in the history of the church's involvement with Indigenous people in Australia which we can gladly rejoice and be proud of. But I think there's also much that we really need to face with honesty. For much of the history of this diocese, in particular regard to Indigenous people, is probably one of neglect rather than engagement. To be sure, there were some good attempts along the way. There was Penindi Mission at Port Lincoln in the 19th century, St Francis House at Semaphore in the 1950s. There was the ordination of Ken Hampton and the establishment of the Nunga ministry in the 1980s and the 1990s. And there was also much good work being done by Anglicare within Indigenous people of Adelaide. But I think we'd have to say we haven't done a great lot, really. It's an area in which we, the diocese, haven't really overly committed ourselves to. There's been highlights along the way, but if we look back over the close to 200 years, we could say there probably hasn't been a lot done. We could take that, of course, to wider Australia. So if we take into consideration experiences of the history of the National Anglican Church, as well as other Christian churches, it's hard not to view the Indigenous encounter with the Christian Church as being very much a mixed blessing. However, having said that, there are many Indigenous Christians who take their part in the life and ministry of the Church, and we should be very thankful for that. But there are some people who Indigenous Christians who bring their wealth of Indigenous experience and share that with the wider Church. The Church, of course, doesn't exist within a vacuum. It's part of a wider culture, and tares and wheat coexist. It's proved difficult sometimes for the Church to shake off the influence of the wider society, and this is where Rowan Williams' point about which map are we following. And I think in the past, if we look back with honest eyes, we can see that the Church hasn't always been able to shake off the influence of the society around it. And it's been difficult sometimes for the Church to discern the true master from the other masters, who would rather see the Church fulfil its role as keeper of morals, order, and support the establishment. Controversial missionary Ernest Gribble, who was ably supported by the first Aboriginal deacon James Noble and his wife Angela, came into great displeasure for highlighting the atrocious massacre of Aboriginal people by police at Mandoc Mission in Western Australia in 1926. Gribble, by all accounts, and even his supporters, said he was a very difficult person to get along with. But he brought that sense of persistence to what he saw as injustices against the Aboriginal people who were in his care. He had a very paternalistic view of missionary work, but nonetheless he still saw that he had a role to protect the Aboriginal people from the wider society. The background to that massacre was that some Aboriginal women were kidnapped, and the Aboriginal men retaliated by killing who they thought was one of the perpetrators. And so the police responded by massacring a whole group of people. So rather than just one or two, they massacred a whole group of people, men, women and children. Gribble was absolutely furious about this and took it up with not only the wider church but also with the local establishment and police and so forth. Very shortly after he did that, the local Anglicans agitated against him, and he caused displeasure not only with the local Anglicans but also with his own bishop. And sadly the bishop sided with more establishment principles rather than the truth that Gribble was trying to point out. The two police were found guilty of the massacre, and they were given promotions and moved to other posts. It would be, we could say that perhaps that was a one-off, but sadly, the story of the massacre of Aboriginal people is a large one. Henry Reynolds estimates that there was probably over 300,000 Aboriginal men, women and children